Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. For those who are just tuning in for this public plenary session and don't already know, the Washington Center for Equitable Growth is a nonprofit research and grant-making organization dedicated to advancing evidence-backed ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with Deputy Secretary of the Treasury Department, Wally Adeyemo. But first, since this is the final day of Equitable Growth's Grantee Conference, I want to recognize all the ground we've covered over the last 4 days. This week's conference, entitled Equitable Growth 2022, People and Research Advancing Economic Evidence, has included 50 presentations of research projects, more than 30 in-person policymaker meetings at the White House, on the Hill, and in agencies, and panel discussions on the importance of federal government economic statistics and how inequality and concentrated markets affect the tools policymakers use to combat inflation and keep the US economy growing. Just this morning, the Treasury Department's Office of Economic Policy hosted 20 Equitable Growth grantees who had traveled to DC for a discussion of how research and researchers can best plug into the policymaking process. This biennial conference is an opportunity for our academic network to get feedback on their research and, importantly, to discuss their research with policymakers. Ensuring research is accessible to policymakers and is informative to current policy debates is central to our mission. And the Grantee Conference is a unique opportunity for us to build bridges between our academic and policy networks. And that is why I'm so excited to introduce our next speaker. I've spent my career as an economist dedicated to researching the challenges facing communities of color, particularly the Black community, Black men and Black women. So I know what a key role the Treasury Department can play to help advance equity and growth in the US. In addition to printing our money and collecting our taxes, very important responsibilities, this is the agency that regulates many banks and financial institutions, administers key income support programs such as the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, and analyzes and recommends economic policies that have the potential to reshape our country. Which is why I can think of few people better to discuss what the Biden administration is doing to support the recovery, in particular its focus on communities that have historically been left behind, than Deputy Secretary Wally Adeyemo. Deputy Secretary Adeyemo has held many prominent positions in both the public and private sectors. Before becoming the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury last year, he served as the first president of the Obama Foundation, where he worked with the former president and first lady to help them continue giving back to the country as private citizens. He also served in the Obama White House as Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. Deputy Secretary Adeyemo was responsible for coordinating the policymaking process related to international finance, trade and investment, energy, and environmental issues. He also served as President Obama's representative to the G7 and the G20. Deputy Secretary Adeyemo also served as the first Chief of Staff of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was founded after the financial crisis to protect Americans from unfair consumer financial practices. Deputy Secretary Adeyemo earned his bachelor's at the University of California, Berkeley, and his law degree from Yale University. With that, please welcome Deputy Secretary Adeyemo.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that kind introduction. And let me thank the Washington Center for the cutting edge research you're doing and how it has impacted the policy choices we've made in the Biden administration. And I think improved outcomes for people of color and people throughout this country. And I'm so happy to be with you today.
Well, thank you for joining us, Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, and for taking the time to talk with me today. I do have a few questions to get us started, and then hopefully we will have time for some audience Q&A at the end. So for those watching at home, please submit your questions in the Q&A box on your screens, and please identify yourself and your organization as part of your question so that we know who you are. So first, Deputy Secretary, can you talk about the historic day one executive order President Biden issued on racial equity, how that came about, and how that has influenced your work at the Treasury Department?
Well, Michelle, as you know well, President Biden had been talking about racial equity during the campaign and well before the campaign as part of the Obama-Biden administration. But even before that, it's been an issue that he has thought deeply about. And I think that during the campaign, he introduced this concept of us building back better. And the idea there that underlied that was the idea that those people who had in lots of ways been left behind by economic policy, who had been the most impacted by the pandemic, should be put first in terms of the way we think about policy going forward. And as you know well, and as the people who are joining us know well, people of color were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic because they tended to do lower wage jobs that didn't allow you to do them from home necessarily. They also had less access to health care and to health insurance and the other services that help protect millions of Americans from the pandemic, especially during the worst days. So as we thought about what we did to help restore both the economy, but also public health coming out of the pandemic, the president continued to stress the importance of ensuring that we do that in an equitable way. And we saw that in the American Rescue Plan. $1 trillion of the $1.9 trillion flowed through the Treasury Department. And one of the most impactful things we did was the child tax credit, which helped reduce poverty amongst Black and brown children in this country by 2 million. It was probably one of the most effective things that we've done in over a generation. I think we're still learning important lessons from that work that's influencing the way we think about the equitable administration of policy in the Biden administration. And I'm hoping that the work you and academics do in the years to come will help us better understand the impact of the child tax credit and how we can make sure policies like these become long-term and permanent features of America's economic system.
Thank you for that. And then, since you mentioned the American Rescue Plan, shortly after day one, we get the American Rescue Plan, which directs the Treasury Department to, among other things, pursue what may be our most ambitious anti-poverty initiative since LBJ, the Enhanced Child Tax Credit. Can I ask you, what did Treasury learn by administering that program? What additional research is still needed? And do you see any of those enhancements, the increased amount, the refundability, the advanceability, coming back at some point?
I think it's important to point out that, as you know, the child tax credit existed before the American Rescue Plan. But what the president did was he wanted to make sure that the child tax credit was more equitable, that it reached people who may not pay taxes because they earn too little money. It reached families that may not have been naturally inclined to get into the system. I think what we learned by administering the child tax credit was about the potential impact of policies like this one that seeks to reach people who are the least likely to participate in the system and the impact that could have on outcomes for young people in our country. And improving their outcomes is critical to improving society, especially when it comes to young children of color who tend to live in communities where they are in need of the types of resources that were provided here. And I think from my standpoint, as somebody who was charged with helping to implement the child tax credit, the most important thing that I learned was a lesson that many of you already knew, that in order to execute something that is equitable, you need to be thoughtful about the choices you make in terms of execution. And one of the most important choices was making sure that in many of these communities, you found trusted messengers to talk to people about signing up for the child tax credit, largely because fundamentally for many of these communities, they have not been in a situation previously where they feel as if they engage with the IRS to get help, and many of the benefits that we provide today come through the Internal Revenue Service, be it the child tax credit, be the earned income tax credit. And our goal has got to be to make sure that those tax credits reach more people. And as part of our effort, we establish relationships with thousands of stakeholder groups that are in these communities to help us get and go to that last mile with these community members in order to get them to sign up. I think the other thing that we learned from this effort was that traditional means of delivering resources may not be the best way to get to communities that are the most marginalized in our country. And we need to be thoughtful about how we not only conduct outreach to them, but how we include them in the system. Thinking about languages, for example, we have to make sure that we're providing information to people, not in one, not in two, but in many different languages, because we're a diverse country in which we can't expect people to be able to access information in the way that in English or on a computer. And how do we make sure that someone who may not have internet at home has the ability to get the information they need to make sure that they can get the child tax credit, because often that's the person who needs it most. So I think that from my perspective, one of the most important things that we learned was the importance of implementation. But I think the other lesson that we learned was that fundamentally, the key thing that we need to provide longer term support for our families in this country, it's particularly poor families in this country, in the form of things like the child tax credit. And the features that were included as part of the American Rescue Plan had a real impact on reducing the level of poverty in this country.
Yes, it did. In terms of convincing policymakers to reestablish the enhanced CTC, and more generally, convincing the country to support income support policies like the CTC, or even wealth building policies like, say, canceling student debt, what's your view on how much the administration should lean into the racial justice arguments? At Equitable Growth, we've tried to actually quantify the ways in which racial, ethnic, and other disparities, including gender disparities, constrict economic growth. In other words, these types of disparities make us all worse off. Do you think that's persuasive?
I do think it's persuasive, just to answer the question simply, but I think that it's even more persuasive when you have data to back it up. And that's why I think the work that you do is so critical, because it is intuitive to understand that if some Americans are held back, it hurts all Americans. And one of the things I do a great deal of my time here at Treasury is spent on national security and thinking about America's competitive position in the world. And what I know is that ultimately, the fact that we have unrealized potential in marginalized communities in this country are holding us all back is something that we should all identify as a national priority for us. So investing in communities like the community I lived in before I came here on the south side of Chicago is critical not only for the people who live on the south side of Chicago, it's not only critical for the people who live in Chicago, it's critical for all of us that those individuals are given the ability to do exactly what they want to do, contribute to the full extent possible to our economic success as a country. And the thing that a CEO told me at one point when they were thinking about making an investment on the south side of Chicago is that the thing that we know in this country is that talent exists everywhere, in every community. But the thing that doesn't exist today is opportunity. And if we match that opportunity with talent, it gives us the ability to unlock the unrealized potential of our economy in major and important ways that'll make us more competitive going forward. So I do think that the work you do is critically important, because I think that the moral case is the most important one in terms of addressing systemic racism. But I do think that having the data to point out that by doing this, we not only address something that speaks to our highest ideals, but it also improves our economy, not just for those communities that we are quote unquote helping, but also for all Americans going forward.
Yes, someone once said to me, speaking of the distribution of talent, that in fact, just affirming what you said, talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. So absolutely affirming your response there, Deputy Secretary Adeyemo. Since we do have an audience of mostly academics, I'd be remiss to not ask a titillating question about data, but it does connect to what we're talking about, which is being able to analyze the impact of policies on different racial, ethnic, and gender groups. I know the Treasury Department collects a lot of data. The tax return I send in every year comes to mind, and that you're thinking hard about how to bring an equity lens to data collection and analysis across the agency. Can you please say more about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I think the reality is that, and you all know this because you're researchers, the questions you ask are sometimes the most important things in terms of collecting the type of data you need to inform good research. And I think that we, as we designed the components of the American Rescue Plan that were housed here at Treasury, tried very hard to ask the right questions of the grantees and the others who were receiving that money in order to make sure that we were collecting the data that would be useful to you and to your peers in terms of writing about this work in a way that would contribute to ensuring that as we go forward and we respond to crises in this country of any kind, we're doing it in a more equitable way. I think a great example of that was when it came to the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, where where Congress approved over $40 billion to go towards helping to ensure that we reduce the number of evictions during the pandemic. And the truth was that this program took a while to start up because we had underinvested in these services for decades. So it took time for people to build them up. And over time, we were able to prevent over 1 million evictions. But in addition to the impact we had on the lives of the people who were able to stay in their homes, on the lives of their children, the data and the information we've collected from that program, we hope will inform not only the ability of us to do this better in the future, but also inform the ability of researchers in general to think through how we can prevent evictions going forward. There's no reason that in America, 1 million people are evicted each year outside the pandemic. We have the tools and the capacity to address this in a meaningful way. The question is, do we have the will? And I think that the president's desire to make sure that we're doing things in an equitable way and Congress's ability to have flexible funding has now put state and local governments in a position where they have the infrastructure to do this work. Now the question is, how can research help inform how we do this in the most targeted way going forward? I can say the same thing about the state small business credit initiative. I'm from a community in Southern California, east of Los Angeles, that has been underinvested in for decades. The financial crisis was a moment where that became evident to anyone who wanted to see, as we saw eviction rates go through the roof. And the reality is that with those eviction rates, it meant that anyone who could afford to moved and left those communities. And the question is, how do you get capital back into those communities going forward? The State Small Business Credit Initiative is one of those ways in which we're trying to target capital from the federal government to get back in the communities that have been marginalized, underinvested in, and by doing that to help build the ecosystem. But the thing we know is that oftentimes lending, and we've known this because of redlining, is often done in a discriminatory way. So how do we collect information on how this capital is being allocated to help us in the future ensure that we're pushing against what often happens both in a de facto and a de jure way, which is that capital doesn't necessarily get to the most deserving people who often live in communities like the one that many of us are from, but actually goes to communities where they already have access to plenty of capital. So I think that from my standpoint, we're trying to collect as much data through the American Rescue Plan as possible. But you made this point about your tax returns. Every American should, and almost everyone does, send in a tax return, but we don't collect racial information on those tax returns for a lot of reasons. But what we've been doing at Treasury is trying to find a way to take the data we have and other data in the federal government to try and create ways to determine the race of taxpayers in a manner that allows us, in a way that doesn't reveal the name of the taxpayer, but allows us to think through the racial identity of taxpayers in a way that allows us to provide data to researchers who are trying to conduct research on research using some of this data to better understand both how that data influences public policy. You think about things like the child tax credit or the stimulus checks that went out to taxpayers. What impact are those things having on people by race is an important questions that we want to be able to answer because they help us better understand how we can direct policy into the future. So we're trying to find ways to use the data that we do have to better understand how we go forward in terms of producing better equitable policy in the future.
Okay. One area where we do have pretty reliable data is on inflation. Now, we could quibble with how we could better disaggregate the CPI or the PCE so that we better understand which communities are facing which price pressures. And a number of Equitable Growth funded researchers are working on that, by the way. But we know the trend has not been good over the last year, to say the least. We also know that Black workers face higher unemployment rates generally and are the first to be laid off during downturns. How do you at Treasury think about combating inflation while also preserving the labor market gains we've seen over the last 2 years and not undermining progress on racial equity?
Yeah, I think those are important questions. And I think everyone has heard from the president and also from Secretary Yellen that addressing inflation is our top priority. And the reason it's our top priority is because higher costs impact the people who earn the least. And while people have seen wages go up over the course of the pandemic, and we've seen historic gains in terms of employment, the thing we want to make sure is that those wage gains aren't eaten up by higher cost overall. So the president's made very clear that he supports the Fed as they take action. As you all know very well, the Fed is primarily responsible for addressing inflation, but we know that the federal government also has a role through the executive branch. And the way that I think about this is that ultimately what we need to do is make sure that we focus on the supply side of the economy. How do we expand the capacity of the economy? How do we get more people into the labor market? How do we make sure that people who have been left out of the labor market have access to getting into the labor market in order to help with labor force participation? When we think about inflation, it's a global phenomenon. A lot of it's being driven by the two shocks that we're all living through. One is COVID-19, the other one is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And one of the things that I think that I've increasingly been focused on is how do we use more of the American Rescue Plan money to encourage job training in order to make sure that more people of color are getting into the labor market, more women are returning to the labor market? How do we think through using some of the money that's in the American Rescue Plan to increase the production of affordable housing in order to improve the supply there as well? Because ultimately our goal has got to be to make sure that while the Fed is taking the steps needed to bring down inflation, we're also taking the steps we need to expand the supply in our economy. And doing those two things well will put us in a position where Black and brown people will have access to jobs and opportunity in our economy, as well as all Americans.
Absolutely. Given your many years in high-level economic policymaking, I'm curious, and I think our academics would be interested in this as well. What do you think are the big unanswered questions in the field? Do you ever find yourself thinking, how do we not know the best policy design to solve this problem? Or looking in vain for a key statistic that would be really helpful?
Yeah, I think you touched on this earlier, and I think the thing that I am always looking for is ways that we can use data to tell the story about why investing in underrepresented communities is an investment that is good for all Americans. I think it's intuitively makes sense to everyone. I think the data is there. The key is making sure that we're doing the work. And this isn't only the work, you doing the work, but it's conversations with universities to make sure they're funding positions for academics to come there and to get PhDs to do this research, and making sure that we're investing in that type of research is critical. I think the other place where I continue to be interested is thinking through labor force participation amongst communities of color. We know many of the barriers have to do with systemic racism, but better understanding those barriers in order to make sure that we can design policies that will address them. We know today that unemployment amongst communities of color is far higher than the overall average. If we were able to design policies to change that, that would have a meaningful impact on labor shortages that we have in this economy. And I think that it gets back to our earlier conversation about talent being equally distributed, but opportunity not being. And there are things we're doing to try and address that. But as you know, one of the things that is the most important to us is given where resources stand, how can we best target those resources to address the challenges we face? So those are some of the questions that I think increased work by you and your peers would be quite helpful to us on.
Okay. Now I have one last question, Deputy Secretary. And so it is this one. But before I ask it, I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please do put it in the chat box. We are so fortunate to have the Deputy Secretary here to answer questions. So you may not get another opportunity like this one. So if you do have a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat box. But let me ask my final question, which is, looking forward now, Treasury is facing another big implementation challenge with the Inflation Reduction Act being signed into law last month. What elements of that bill do you think will make the biggest difference for equitable economic growth?
And I think there's two that I would specifically speak to, and one has to do with the clean energy provisions. And I think that fundamentally, like most challenges that we face, people of color are disproportionately going to be impacted by climate change because of the way our economy is designed, because of the health impacts. I think the Treasury Department has a huge deal of responsibility for putting together a set of tax credits that will help to create a clean energy economy in America. And the goal here is to make sure that we address the climate change in a way that reduces our dependence on greenhouse gases, but also helps create the economy of the future. Within this bill, there are provisions on prevailing wages and apprenticeship, which will mean that these jobs that are created in the future will be living wage jobs. And traditionally, the reason this matters to communities of color is because oftentimes if these entry-level jobs, if the ecosystem we're creating is one in which you have jobs that are at prevailing wage, it creates better opportunities for us as we enter these fields. If you're entering those fields at the lowest rung, you know that you're going to hopefully be in a place where you're earning a living wage. I think the other key for us is going to be making sure that people have equitable access to information on these tax credits so that small businesses, large businesses, individuals who want to do everything from buying an electrical vehicle to trying to become a producer in the communities that are usually underrepresented have access to these credits going forward. And the final thing I'd say is that the $80 billion devoted to IRS modernization matter a great deal to us. Because the IRS, while it's a tax collector, it's also a benefits provider. So the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, all of the tax credits related to the clean energy transition, and the ACA credits all come through the IRS. We need to improve our ability to provide those benefits to people to make sure more people have access to them. And we also want to make sure that for those of you who are regularly paying your taxes, you have the smoothest experience possible. You can get through on the phone. You can find the information you want on the internet. We're providing it to you in languages that you need. And then finally, we ultimately want to make sure that those people who are trying to avoid paying their taxes, which data shows us are the people who make the most money in society, are required to do exactly what you're doing, which is paying taxes in order to make sure they can fund things like the advanced child tax credit, our military, our education system. So I think fundamentally, when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, almost every single element, and I would say every single element, will have an impact on these communities. But those two in particular are the ones I'm paying the most attention to, since those are the ones that I have responsibility for implementing.
Okay, well, thank you so much for answering my questions, Deputy Secretary Adeyemo. I think we have time really just for one question. I must admit, I'm not quite understanding the question, but perhaps you will, Deputy Secretary. So I'm going to give it a shot. This question is from Raphael at the University of South Carolina. His question is, what consumer markets does the administration regard as providing opportunities for fairness assessment and potential regulation other than housing, credit, and labor? And I'm happy to repeat that question, Deputy Secretary.
Yeah, if you don't mind repeating it, that'll help.
Sure, absolutely. His question is, what consumer markets does the administration regard as providing opportunities for fairness assessment and potential regulation, other than the housing, credit, and labor markets?
It's a great question, and what I will do is take advantage of it to talk about a place where I think that more research is probably needed in terms of the impact on consumers, and particularly consumers of color, and I would say that's crypto. I think crypto is a space in which one of the things that we at Treasury are very interested in is how can we promote responsible innovation. And we think that responsible innovation has the ability to unlock economic opportunity in our country. I think one of the things that I and all of us all know is that when you think about access to banking and to payments, it is too scarce in communities of color throughout our country. In some ways, alternative payment methods have been brought about to address that in these communities. I think the key thing we have to do is make sure that as those things are developed, the adequate consumer protections are in place so that consumers can take advantage of these new tools, but they're also protected against potential threats that they create for them. As you mentioned earlier, one of my first jobs in government was being chief of staff to Senator Warren when we started the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And that was on the back of a financial crisis and a housing crisis that disproportionately impacted communities of color. I think that being mindful about innovation in the financial services space to ensure that the right protections are put in place to protect consumers while promoting innovation is a place where I think research is needed. And I look forward to seeing the work that you and your peers do in this area. I know our time is up and it was probably too short, but let me say a word of thanks again for having me today and for this great conversation. And I look forward to speaking again with you.
Well, thank you so much for your time and insight, Deputy Secretary Adeyemo. And thank you to our audience for joining us today and over the course of the week, whether virtually or in person. This biennial gathering for Equitable Growth's grantees really showcases the organization's mission in action, and I've been so thrilled to be a part of it. I do want to take a brief moment to thank the entire Equitable Growth staff. So I want to recognize them, especially Corinne Davis, Christian Edligan, Elena Waski, Shonda Williams, David Mitchell, and Adrian Narayan. Here's to another successful Equitable Growth event and to getting together, hopefully in person, in 2 years. Thanks so much.